Hello and welcome. I'm Kylee Stone, the host of the Uncharted Leader and your coach in creating a new paradigm of leadership. Today, I'm really thrilled to have a conversation about predominantly purpose, but also so many things, actually. Emilie Sydney-Smith is the CEO of ExO, and we are going to get talking about a number of things. One of my big passions in particular is purpose. And this is pretty much what Emillie is all about. She's about massive transformative purpose. She has experience in working with large organizations, and her purpose is ultimately to see organizations operate 10 times better, not just the 10%. And there are a couple of things I want to highlight before we get stuck into today's conversation. And one of them is what's immediately present for me when I not only met Emillie, but when I talk with Emillie, is just the extraordinary difference that she makes in the world. And the fact that she has said, even for herself, that she really is in her dream job. We are at a time when there is a lot of conversation in the world about the impact of the pandemic on women. There is also a lot of conversation on, what are we doing to have women in leadership? And I think I'm absolutely delighted to say that, it's people like Emillie who are having a massive impact in the world and an absolute demonstration of what it is to be an extraordinary woman in leadership. So, Emillie, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you. And wow, what a lovely thing of you to say.
Well, I think it's important, firstly, Emillie, to acknowledge that, right? Because I think certainly in, my 20 odd years plus of employment, and then, in our generation, certainly there was a particular pathway we took to become a leader and to be a contribution in the world. And so I think one of the things that I've noticed, especially for women, because women are really great at empowering others and the focus on the team and making sure the team's always acknowledged. And sometimes that can come at a missing of acknowledgement of who we are in the world and what it has taken for us. So I do really want to acknowledge you for, where you are in the world and what you're doing. And we are going to talk a lot about that today because it's extraordinary what you've accomplished. So do you mind actually, can we start with talking about, how you have said that this is your dream job and what makes this your dream job?
Absolutely. So if I go back about 10 years ago, I was a closet geek. I absolutely loved technology. I was reading a technology book a week. I figured that I'm a female. I don't have an engineering degree. Well, I'm not really allowed to play in that area. And eventually I started to go to conferences figuring that I'd be the dumbest person in the room. And then I realized, actually, no, I had self-educated myself enough that I was allowed to play. And at that point I said, well, I might as well go and shift my career out of the oil and gas industry into this sort of future focused tech world. I had just read this book by Salim Ismail called Exponential Organizations, looking at the fastest growing companies in the world and the fact that there's this whole new business model. And I said, that's what I want to do. And it just so happened that I was going to a friend's conference about a week later, and Salim was speaking there. And I said to him, Salim, can I come and work for you? And he said, actually, we really need someone with an energy background. Yes, please. And I've been able to essentially, in many ways, create my own role. I was, doing the coaching. I became CEO close to 3 years ago now, and I just love it. The ability to go into large companies where people often feel very hemmed in by their roles. They don't get the time to actually sit up and look at how they're going to grow the company. It's always just putting out fires. And then you say to them, well, let's create a purpose. Let's actually think about why this company exists in the first place. What's your personal purpose? It just brings people to life. And they love going through the process of saying, no, let's not just do things that are 10% better. Let's do things that are tenfold better. And when they feel that they actually have the tools for that, then change is not scary. Change is only scary when people don't understand how to go about it. But when you tell people and enabled people, wow, it's an amazing feeling. It's an amazing feeling to see the profits that come out of it and the purpose-driven stuff that is really great for the world. But it's also amazing. We just had some people who 5 years ago went through a sprint with us, and they came back to us. We hadn't heard from them for a while, and they said, hey, it's the 5th anniversary. So how often do you actually have a work program where people come back and say, 5 years later, this was the best thing we ever did in our career. We think about it every day, and we want to celebrate that 5-year anniversary. So that was a real wonderful moment for us.
It's extraordinary. A couple of things that you've highlighted, I'm curious about hearing a little bit more about. Well, actually, let me go. There's 3 things in particular. Actually, you've mentioned your background kind of in the energy space. The second thing I want to cover off is your views and experience the whole world from your perspective about purpose and your own. And then the last thing you did mention, which I want to come back to, is if you could share with us about what you mean by sprint, because I know that this is a particular methodology or approach that you have with ExO, and I'm fascinated to hear kind of what that means. So we, certainly as listeners, we get a sense of actually what that means for you. So, but can we go back just you? So you started your career. Can you tell us about the beginning of your career then?
Sure. So I actually ended up working in Indonesia for a little while with the royal family there. They had a hotel, which was just a wonderful thing to be doing at the beginning of your career, to be doing that. When I came back to Sydney, I actually wanted to do something that was a bit more intellectually focused, and answered a job ad and ended up actually working on the deregulation of the electricity markets in Australia and New Zealand. And it was actually through a conference company. And, I always sort of thought, oh, well, that's, it doesn't really sound like investment banking or something cool like that. But what a fantastic job, because as someone who's actually planning out what the conference program should be in 9 months' time, you're predicting where the world is going to go, what the trends are going to be, and then it's your job to call up the biggest CEOs in the industry and say, will you come and speak for free on this topic? So what a fantastic way to start a career in your 20s. And then I won a green card in the lottery for the US.
What?
So, yeah.
What a story. How does that happen?
Well, exactly. So it is truly a lottery.
Right.
Use it or lose it. So I moved over, and I was in the oil and gas industry. I missed that I had been with this wonderful company that was one of the first oil and gas companies on the east coast of Australia. And it was an amazing time because we were having to literally create the whole industry. So again, that sort of creating new things was a real buzz for me. And then, we had grown that incredibly fast. It was, real market darling at the time. And then moved to the States, wanted to be in New York rather than Houston, being in oil and gas. And one of the directors from the Sydney company had actually said, now there's this one guy, Cameron Smith, and I just know that you should work with him. And I had contacted Cameron, and he said, not looking, don't even bother. 6 months later, went to a conference, sat down next to him accidentally at one of the events, and we just hit it off. He said, come work for me the next week. And he became an amazing mentor. So we were basically working with private equity, bringing them oil and gas deals all around the world. So I was internationalizing his business. It was amazing to be there through 2008 because we had been bought out by a bigger investment bank. So to just watch trading floors, just, people sitting there going, oh, what just happened? Yeah. There is no market, all of those things. Was just a really great time to be there. Then started my own company. So I decided that, I should be a complete entrepreneur, and it was a failure. So in many ways, I had done all the right things. So basically, someone had contacted me through LinkedIn and said, I can see that you've got all of these oil and gas contacts. I'm from one of the big aerospace and defense companies, and we have all this amazing technology that should really also have a second use in oil and gas. Can you help us? And eventually he and I said, well, let's actually create a company around this. And so we ended up with two of the biggest aerospace and defense companies saying, hey, you have access to any IP that we own if you can find a secondary market for it. So I go to all of the chief technology officers of the biggest oilfield services companies in the world, which was amazing to be able to go and say to them, well, if you could have any technology, what would it be? And they would give us this shopping list of things that, you know, they'd really been trying to create for decades and hadn't been able to. And so, you know, doing all the right things of listening to the customer. And then we would go back to the aerospace and defense companies who would say, oh, of course we have the technology. We are blah, blah, blah. And I kept sort of thinking, well, this is a bit strange because all these oilfield services companies have been working on these really tough problems for years and years, and they haven't been able to crack it. Anyway, after about a year, we had never actually got one of the specifications from the aerospace and defense companies on any of these pieces of IP that they claimed to have. And eventually I realized that they didn't even know whether they had them. They actually asked us for money to go and look through their own company where they would find that piece of IP. At which point I was like, I'm not sure that you actually have this.
Yeah, right.
So that was a real awakening to really do a lot more due diligence and understand what was going on. And that's when I sort of moved into ExO proper. So in fact, it did me a really good turn.
Yeah, right.
That's really, I learned a lot.
Yeah, right. That's really fascinating. And I think many of us would probably resonate with that, right? Like so it was during that time when you came across the book Exponential?
That's right.
Yeah.
Yes. And I'd really been trying to find different ways to get into the industry anyway. And that sort of tech idea of, hey, we're going to take a whole lot of IP and bring it into other industries and commercialize it had been sort of one way. But frankly, working with large companies and helping them to survive is actually much better, because I do really worry. We spend so much time looking at the disruption that is happening that I worry about tens of thousands of people being laid off every time one of these big companies implodes. You know, I come from the oil and gas industry, and that industry last week had an absolutely pivotal moment of, 4 huge bits of news that were really damaging. Big shareholder votes that were difficult, the International Energy Agency coming out and saying we should never actually drill any more oil and gas wells ever. And so, I see this disruption of my old own industry happening. And, we're working with some of the biggest oil and gas companies around the world, and it's fascinating to be trying to help them and really helping their people to pivot into something much more useful.
So I want to now talk about purpose, given that's now where you work, what you work in and have your life be about, which I have to say I love, all about purpose. And so I'm curious about the moment that you had the connection, because we know, as you know, right, and for anyone out there, if you've not really gotten a profound connection with your purpose, there really is a profound connection. When you have that moment, there's just no going back. That's kind of my experience anyway, Emily. So I want to just go to that moment that whether it was a page in the book, a saying in the book, was it picking up the book? Was there something he said in the book? Was there a moment for you where you just kind of went, this is it, or this is, and that led to you moving into this space?
No, I think it gradually happened, but actually working out the definition of my own massive transformative purpose, I actually originally had a different one and it wasn't quite clicking. And I was also finding that I was debating with a lot of people whether technology was good or bad. And I really had a very strong view over whether the net benefit was important, and so I changed. But my previous one had been really about the convergence of different technologies and being able to see patterns in different ways. And I think having read so many different technology books, one of the things that I love is that with the people that we're working with. So to come back to the sprint, we're working with people within these large companies over 10 weeks when they actually develop out a couple of really big ideas. And during those times, they'll be, you know, throwing all sorts of amazing ideas and quite often some very obscure kind of technologies at us. And they need very quick feedback. And so, you know, these teams will have done a lot of work, they'll suddenly present it to us, and then they're sort of expecting, hey, Emily, you know, what do you think? And so the ability to think back through all of those different technology books and all the people I've met around the world, which has been really great, and be able to say, oh, this obscure thing, you should go and talk to that person because they're the top in the world, and I can make that introduction right now. And, you know, here are these other things that you should bring. So that linkage part of it is just one of the most favorite parts of my job.
You know, that's really fascinating, and I'm not sure if it's just because of my listening, but certainly I've heard you say a few times now, even right from the beginning, hearing what you did, even in the, you know, when you went to the States, that there is a real acknowledgement, I suppose, of connection and your love of connection that happens in all of that. Is that probably the heart of that for you?
Very much.
Right.
And so being able to access the top people in the world at whatever it is really important to us. And I think there was something wonderful about spending time in New York because, you know, for instance, I would get to meet people through Salim and this amazing network and all sorts of other networks. You know, so when you have an amazing astronaut friend call you up and say, hey, there's a thing, you know, dinner happening at the UN tonight. It's only in an hour, but do you want to come along? And you go, okay. And then you sit down next to one of the top economists in the world and, you know, all these amazing people. It's extraordinary being in the center of that. My husband is an Academy member. He was, you know, Hollywood, ran a movie studio. And so those kind of connections are really fun. But I think, you know, in Australia, there's this feeling that the word networking is a dirty word. And as soon as you get to New York, well, you just couldn't survive if you felt that way. And so although I kind of have to tone things down a little bit now that I'm back in Australia, it's the most important thing, I think, to women actually really succeeding in business.
So when you say tone that down, so do you think there's I mean, I suppose most people would assume that, you know, that I suppose that's the whole comparison of the States versus the Australian way, right? But was your experience quite different when you were in the States?
So when we get to the States, because there are so many Aussie expats there, there's almost these people who will come and tell you, now, here are the 5 things that you need to think about. And one of them is, okay, in Australia, you downplay anything that you're good at and maybe you discount it by 20%. Well, here everyone is actually embellishing by 20%. And if you're, you know, dealing with that 40% difference, you're never going to get anywhere. And so I was always very careful not to embellish, but to actually, you know, tell the story in a different way. And what I've found here is that you just have to tone things down a lot and sort of, you know, talk around things a lot first and, you know, be very gentle.
Yes.
No, I can't come out in Australia necessarily and say the truth, which is that we're actually creating 70-fold returns on investment for our clients, because here they'll go, oh, she must be joking. That must just, you know, you know, it really, the trust goes.
Yes. That's such a shame, because, you know, I guess I'm now left with the question, Emily, about whether or not that in and of itself is one of the barriers to people producing the results that they say they want. Because if that's a reaction to that particular conversation, where does it leave us, all those, wherever you are? And I think that's for all of us, you know, whether as an individual or, you know, in our own personal life, or whether it's in business or as an executive or in your career, that if we've got that paradigm in our way of thinking and our way of speaking and our way of interacting with people, where does that leave us in our ability to truly fulfill, you know, on our commitment, which I guess is kind of your game, right? Because, you know, the game of purpose is fundamentally to be able to fulfill, you know, growth beyond traditional paradigms. But where does that leave us then here?
Well, the bigger effect is that it leaves us presuming that we can only work in the existing industries. And if you look at almost any company, they're in a highly commodified, highly competitive industry. So they might be able to do a little tweak that makes them, tiny bit differentiated from the rest of the competition. But that's a crazy place to be playing in. And especially as Australia looks at, well, what happens if we can't be selling our iron ore? Couldn't we just have a bigger thought? So, for me, I say, well, every 25 years, the global GDP doubles. So it's 90 trillion now. That means, there's 90 trillion of completely new industries to be created. Why don't we go create those? And so we're trying to actually pull together a large group of companies to say, well, let's decide which industry we should create. Let's go do this together. Let's dominate the world. It can be the Silicon Valley of whatever this new industry will be. And people say, yes, I want to get involved. But they also say, wow, that's really audacious. And to me, if I was in New York, that wouldn't sound audacious, but it shocks me that people sort of think that this is really unusual. We need to get over that sort of point.
So just on that, one of the things that what do you whether it's obviously there's I don't expect any detail from a confidentiality, but if we were just to look overall, right, in that game there are no doubt obstacles that what would you say are the single biggest or the biggest, or what's the most obvious obstacle that you've encountered when you bring that conversation together, given what we said, that in an Australian environment, right, it's not typical and it occurs really audacious and out of the box. What is it that you've experienced happens to be the biggest obstacle for them to actually address, for them to get into that conversation about that growth?
So sometimes it's actually that the people that we work with inside the company, they absolutely see it. So they'll, be trying to say, well, let's do something really big. And then sometimes you go and present it to management and they haven't really come along with the journey enough yet.
Yes.
So for instance, if we have an experience where a company says, well, we really want the teams within the sprint that we're working on to focus on XYZ sort of thing. And often, they're companies that do very large scale, long-term investments that will take a long time to pay off. And so if we look at the original idea and say, well, that's really hard and, that's not a 10x, but here are all the other things that you could do around it that would be a 10x. And we go and present them. And the management often is like, but that's not what we do. And so we'll be saying, but hang on, you could actually spend couple of $1 million, not $2 billion. And you would immediately be, throwing off $100 million per annum in this, rather than in 20 years' time, we might start to make a return. Why won't you look at these kinds of projects? That can be, just a step along the process that we need to bring the management along with that. But it does require some open-mindedness.
Yeah. And what about as a human? What do you see, or from either your own personal experience or even in working with the people, what do you find has been the biggest obstacle as an individual to deal with to get into that space?
So we often work with very command and control kind of structures, and especially around the world. I would say a lot of, for instance, when we're working in Africa, very, very command and control. And we always sort of feel like we're, coming in and setting people free, and isn't it wonderful? And sometimes you'll get people pushing back, like, they're kind of in that lemming mode and they can't imagine actually getting out of it. And so they'll say to us, oh, well, don't you just have a template to fill out? And we're like, no, this is where you actually find, unusual things that are going to have a 10x improvement. And we get them there by the end of the sprint, but it can just take a lot of extra effort. Whereas you come into some companies and they're just raring to go. They just can't wait to find new opportunities. And it's really fun working with both, because you have such a change in both.
Given that you've highlighted this, is just one conversation that I think a lot of us are now attending to. In fact, I had a post on LinkedIn the other day saying that as leaders, we've really got to be courageous in order to give up or let go of traditional management styles, because, let's be honest, the current design of most organizations, well, let's just say probably 99.9%, unless you're a newbie, and even still in the current design, but the design of the organizational structures we find have come out of the Industrial Revolution, which started off when there was a need, or, factory workers, where you did really have the master and apprentice. And now, over time we've evolved, but technology has now rapidly disrupted that model. And we're now got a knowledge-based workforce, and, people are now paid to think. They're not paid to just do, which kind of throws out that whole command control method, right? So given that, I'm really kind of thrilled. I want to hear your view about that, because we are, if there's anything, we are at a juncture. Right, we're at a juncture called, there is a significant amount of that's how it's working, but to be able to produce the results like you're saying, you kind of got to throw that thinking out, right?
Yes, absolutely. So that sort of disenfranchising of employees is really tough, especially when most jobs say, this is what you should do, don't step outside the box, don't upset anyone else, don't get into these turf wars. And I know a lot of people who spend 60, 70% of their time at work dealing with politics. How crazy is that? And so as we see so many industries getting disrupted, let's do the same old thing, where we knew what the problem was, we knew what the answer was, we were hiring people who knew the answer. That's just not possible anymore. We don't even know what the questions are anymore, as we have to evolve and pivot these industries into completely new things. We need people who can go out and find what the question is and then find what the answer is. And so we need to think completely differently about this. And what we're finding companies saying to us is, we used to have people who were leading these various different business units, and they were sort of product managers. Now we need them to be portfolio managers who are investing into a whole lot of different things and testing out and experimenting with various different potential pivots. And they need to be growth minded, not just sort of keeping the declining industry going. And we need to bring in this sense of knowing how to change. Now, having said that, a whole lot of companies have tried and they've gone down the completely wrong path. So if you look at innovation projects, depending on which study you look at, between 72 and 96% of innovation projects are failing in large companies. Well, that equates to $3.5 trillion worth of failed investment around the world in the last decade, at the same time that big tech actually made 7 trillion. This is all in US dollars. And so we're actually also saying to companies, stop, don't just keep on copying the thing that is not working and presuming that, because every other company is doing it, it must be working for them. It's not. And so we're really saying, look, there are processes that are proven to work, but they're not the ones that you're just implementing all the time.
Yes. So given that we know that your expertise is right in that space of 10 times, and it really is challenging old ways of thinking, for anyone who is probably finding themselves in that desire to challenge that traditional approach, is there anything you'd say or suggest is potentially one of the first things they could consider as they try to move that dial?
So we always actually start with clients with actually getting the whole first week is, let's imagine the future. Let's think about 2031, think about exponential technologies and how they will have changed the world. Think about different business models, put yourself in that mindset. And then when you can't unsee how much change is going to happen, that's when you then start to actually do any idea generation. And we also say, don't focus on your problems. So most companies, as soon as they try to innovate, they, spend all this time navel gazing about, prioritizing their own problems, not the market problems. go talk to your customer, go co-design, how to fix one of the customer problems tenfold better than it's ever been done before, because guess what? You will have a huge market by doing that.
Yes.
And so that mindset of not just getting stuck in the usual infighting that happens when you say, well, what are the problems in our own company? And everyone starts pointing fingers at each other.
Yes.
And everyone's in fight or flight instinct mode because everyone's in complaint mode. No, think about what's possible in the future and what you could design. Start by thinking, if I could improve the lives of millions or billions of people, what would I do? That's the exciting starting point.
That's fabulous. You make so much alignment between our views on brand DNA. We do the same in that world, that it is about, sticking your head out and looking in the future and being in that future before you go creating, because otherwise we do get stuck, right, on the current world of solving existing problems that you never, like you say, what's the Einstein quote? We're never going to solve the current problems with the same level of thinking. It's exactly what that's ultimately about, right?
Yes.
So I want to end by usually how we end the interview is a statement, and so I will say a few words about being a leader, and then I'm going to invite you to complete the sentence. Before we do that, I just want to ask you one thing about what it is that's been your greatest, this is probably going to be a hard one considering the work that you're doing, right? But is there anything that you'd say, what is this one of the most a standout, and this could be personally or professionally, as one of your most proudest moments?
We were working with a very large polluter recently, and we were not necessarily focused on curing that. But we knew that we wanted to actually think about technology that would be going into the energy part of this particular company. They produce a lot of their own energy, and they're already making $2 billion worth of investments over the next couple of years into renewables. But when we looked at the pilot project, no one had thought to actually look at it, and it turned out that their emissions went up. And we went, well, let's work out what's going on here, because you don't want to be investing $2 billion on that. And what we realized was that they were actually really uncomfortable with the intermittent nature of solar and wind. And therefore, they were keeping all of the original production on land. So you've basically got all this spinning reserve just in case the solar doesn't work. And so we said, well, you're really uncomfortable about supply and demand. Well, actually, do you know that you could just spend $6 million more over every global site that you have total? Not very much above that $2 billion. And you would actually get the real-time knowledge of supply and demand that you could get comfortable taking 60% of that spinning reserve offline. So that's 12% of emissions, but it's also $300 million worth of fuel savings every year.
Wow.
And so, when we went and presented that to the leadership actually said, I can't comment now, because I'm so shocked at, I don't usually hear here's a $300 million per annum win for a $6 million investment. I think I need to calm down and then come back and say yes. So, those kinds of moments where we can just have such big wins on every scale, environmental, business-wise, and really happy people, the morale of the people who are involved was just great. That was just a wonderful moment.
Very extraordinary, and I am present to the word extraordinary, right? That really is remarkable, and what a contribution. And I think it could be very easy for us, Emily, to get into as human beings when we hear things like that, especially when you say, the piece of work that you were doing was with, traditionally a polluter, right? But no matter who we work with or what's occurring in the world, there is something to be said for the contribution you can be to actually make a difference. And certainly, as I've heard your story, and I think everyone would agree, from your beginnings and what you've done and your journey, and it really is in the world of extraordinary. And I think is a perfect, considering you work for a company called ExO, right? It's just really well done. Congratulations. And I think for anyone, and especially anyone, I think, my invitation certainly to anyone today from hearing Emilie's story is really to trust in your instinct when it comes to seeing something that makes a difference for you, because I think, Emilie, when you there was a turning point when you read that book and you confronted what you did in those difficult times, and you made a decision to take a leap of faith. And despite even what you called as a failure in your first experience with being an entrepreneur, right? Like, you just kept sticking with what you knew. And so I just really want to call that out, and for people to really know that you could sit here and compare yourself to how extraordinary another individual is, such as Emily, or other extraordinary individuals out there in the world who you think are doing remarkable things. But you got to know that each and every one of us have our own individual challenges when it comes to stepping up. So firstly, just really want to thank you, Emily, for sharing your journey and your experiences. What is the one dream that you do have that's not yet fulfilled? So before I get to this completion of the quote, I'm actually fascinated, right? Because I'm in a world like that. I imagine one thing I imagine is, in a game like that, you occur to me as the kind of person who really is a match for your work. Like, what you do is who you are. Yes, is that fair to say?
Absolutely. Yes.
Yes. So I'm now curious then, considering you're in the game of showing up 10 times, what's the 10 times that you're at work on? I've kind of put you on the spot with this one, but let's.
Well, you have, but actually, because I'm doing what I just love, it's actually doing 10 times more of exactly what we're already doing, because number one, it's working.
Yes.
and we just haven't reached enough companies to, every time that we reach a new company, we can make these huge wins, and we're typically creating 8 different initiatives that each have that kind of scale of win within the 10 weeks. So I just want to keep doing this.
Yeah, fabulous. That's really great. Okay, and so let's complete today on a statement that I'll get you to complete for me. A leader is someone who
is audacious in helping their team to create 10x improvements, and accessing the right people to help them do that.
Audacious and team and others in 10 times. And can I ask you for your interpretation definition of audacious? Because I think many of us can, I kind of get, for me, it occurs like, wow, it's like big time thinking, right? Which is kind of occurring in this space of 10 times. Could you just give us clarity for that? When you say for a leader be audacious, what do you challenge them with?
Yeah, and by the way, there are companies out there, the big tech, that actually use the word BHAG. So
Yes,
hairy, audacious goal, which I think is nice as well. I think the audacity is to say, not just we are a telco company, we are whatever, but what is it that is our underlying talent and resource and trust that we can leverage to do things that actually change the world, that actually improve the lives of millions or billions of people? Because when you can actually find a problem to solve that's that big, you'll make money, you'll find a way. And so that audacity to think outside the small box of where you're sitting, and decide to change the world.
What a beautiful place to end. Thanks again for joining me today. It's been a real privilege.
Thank you.